So today, we're going to dive into one of the most powerful and honestly strangest symbols in all of human history, the cross. It's this symbol that somehow stands for both the deepest shame and the greatest power. It's a paradox that has literally split the world for 2,000 years. We're going to unpack exactly why, using a really insightful sermon that gets right to the heart of what this ancient symbol is all about. So let's start with something you might not expect, a really honest confession. This comes from a guy who, on the outside, was the perfect Christian. He had it all, right? Active in his church, successful, blessed. But he admitted that deep down, something was seriously wrong. In his own words, he had all the blessings, but he was missing joy. His faith had just become a transaction. And God's grace, well, that was just his guaranteed ticket to heaven. And this slide really breaks down that crisis he was in. On the surface, he was the poster child for religious devotion, but underneath all that, he felt empty, ashamed, and he was still looking for satisfaction in all the same places the world tells you to look. And this isn't just one guy's story, it's a huge spiritual problem that pushed him to ask a very, very hard question. He basically had to ask himself, is the God I'm worshiping the real God, or is he just a comfortable version I've kind of built for myself? One that just happens to fit all my own wants and desires. And what's wild is that this super modern-sounding problem, it's the exact same issue that a church was struggling with 2,000 years ago in a city called Corinth. Okay, so to really get why the cross was so explosive, we have to travel back in time. We need to understand the world it first showed up in. So picture ancient Corinth. This place was a big deal. It was a major trade hub, so it was rich. It was a center for culture and philosophy, so it was smart. And it was, well, morally a mess. You could call it the Las Vegas of its time. But here's the real kicker. The Christian church in Corinth looked just like the city. It was full of division, arrogance, and all kinds of scandals. This was pretty much the last place on earth you'd expect a message about humility and sacrifice to go over well. All right, so into this world, this city full of pride and power, the Apostle Paul shows up with a message. And it's a message that's so radical, so completely out there, that it just splits everyone right down the middle. That message, of course, was the cross. Now, this is super important. We have to, completely erase the modern picture of the cross from our minds, as a pretty piece of jewelry. To the Roman world, the cross was a state-sponsored tool for torture and public execution. It was saved for the worst of the worst, slaves, traitors, and rebels. It was a billboard for failure, for absolute weakness and public humiliation. And that's why, according to Paul, this message is never neutral. You can't just be meh about it. It's a dividing line. For one group, those he calls the perishing, the idea of a God who gets crucified is just utter nonsense. It's foolish. But for the other group, those being saved, that exact same symbol is the very power of God. There is absolutely no middle ground here. So you gotta ask, why? Why such a huge split? Well, Paul breaks it down for us. He basically lays out the two major worldviews of his day, which really represent two ways that we, as humans, still try to approach God. Okay, so look at this. On one hand, you've got the Jews. For them, it was all about miraculous power. They wanted God to show up with signs and wonders. Their pride was in their spiritual experience. Then you've got the Greeks. Totally different. For them, the big thing was human wisdom, logic, reason, philosophy. Their pride was in their intellect. And the message of the cross? It failed both of their tests. Big time. For the Jews, a Messiah who gets executed in weakness was a total contradiction. It was a stumbling block, a deal breaker. For the Greeks, the whole idea that God would become a man and then die like a common criminal was just illogical. It was complete and utter foolishness. But when you dig down, the root issue wasn't really about belief. It was about control. That's the key. Both groups wanted a God they could put in a box, a God who played by their rules. The Jews wanted a God who would fit their idea of power, and the Greeks wanted a God who would fit their system of logic. But here's where Paul just flips the whole thing on its head. He reveals that the cross wasn't some cosmic accident or a failure. No way. It was God's deliberate, genius plan to completely shatter our human ideas of power and wisdom. First up, Paul just drops this bombshell. Everything the world thinks is so smart, so brilliant, all our philosophy and deep thoughts, from God's point of view, it's basically foolishness. He says he's going to destroy the wisdom of the wise. And then he does the same thing with power.
All that stuff we chase, military strength, political power, success, you name it, he says it's totally weak when you compare it to what God is doing.
And this brings us to the main event, the core idea. The cross is God's divine reversal. It's the one place where he shows what true power and true wisdom really look like. And he does it through what looks to us like the exact opposite, weakness and foolishness. And this one verse from 1 Corinthians just nails it. It says, "For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength." Wow. I mean, think about that. The moment that looks like God's biggest failure was actually his biggest victory. And the plan that seemed like absolute madness turned out to be wiser than anything a human could ever come up with.
Okay, so what does all this ancient history and theology mean for us right now? And what about that speaker we started with, the one who had everything but felt empty inside his perfect religious life?
Let's break it down. The Jews wanted a God of power. The Greeks wanted a God of wisdom. I mean, those aren't bad things, right? The problem, the real issue, was that they wanted God on their terms. They just weren't willing to let go of the steering wheel and let God be God. And that gets us to the absolute heart of it all. The message of the cross doesn't really ask you to understand it with your brain. It's not a puzzle to be solved. It bypasses our pride, it bypasses our reason, and it asks for something much, much harder. It asks for our surrender. It confronts our deepest human instinct, which is to be in control.
And that leaves us right where we started, with the same question that faced the church in Corinth and that faced our speaker. And it's really a question for every single one of us. Are we seeking God for who he has actually revealed himself to be, even when he seems weak or foolish to the world? Or are we really just seeking a God that we've created in our own image, one that makes us feel comfortable and in control?